Your grandparents figured this out a long time ago. They made one pot, they made it simple, they made it stretch, and it was some of the best food that ever came out of an American kitchen. These 7 meals are proof of that. Number 1. Pinto bean and ham hock soup. This is the one pot meal that sustained more poor rural families across the American South than any other dish in history, and the reason is simple. It is nearly impossible to make badly, it costs almost nothing, it feeds you for days, and it gets better every single time you reheat it. You start with dried pinto beans, not canned, because dried beans are cheaper and the texture when they're fully cooked is completely different, creamier, more substantial, with a depth that canned beans simply don't have. You sort through them and rinse them and soak them overnight in cold water so they cook more evenly and digest more easily, and in the morning you drain that soaking water and put the beans in your pot with fresh cold water, enough to cover them by a good 3 inches because they'll absorb a lot as they cook. Then you add your ham hock. One ham hock costs about $2 at most grocery stores, and it is one of the great bargains in American cooking because that single ham hock will flavor an entire pot of beans more deeply and completely than any seasoning packet or bouillon cube ever could. The collagen in the ham hock bone dissolves slowly into the broth as it cooks and makes it thick and silky and rich in a way that water alone never achieves. You bring everything to a boil, skim off any foam that rises to the top, then reduce the heat to the lowest setting your stove will go and let it cook low and slow with the lid slightly ajar for 2 to 3 hours, checking occasionally and adding hot water if the level drops too low. As the beans cook, they swell and soften and begin to release their starch into the broth, and the broth darkens and thickens, and the meat from the ham hock begins to fall off the bone in tender shreds that distribute through the pot. You season with salt only after the beans are fully tender. Salting too early toughens the skins and prevents them from cooking through properly, and your grandma knew this even if she couldn't have told you the science behind it. A little black pepper, a pinch of red pepper flakes if you like heat, and that is all this pot needs. You can eat it straight from the pot as a thick soup or mash some of the beans against the side of the pot with a spoon to thicken it further into something almost stew-like. Either way, it is magnificent. A pot this size costs about $3 total and makes 5 or 6 generous servings, which means you eat it for dinner tonight and lunch tomorrow and dinner again the day after that, and every bowl is better than the last because the flavors keep developing as it sits in the refrigerator overnight. Serve it with cornbread if you have it. Eat it plain if you don't. It needs nothing to be one of the greatest things a pot has ever produced. Number 2. Chicken and dumplings. There is a reason chicken and dumplings has survived in American cooking for over 100 years while dozens of other dishes have faded and been forgotten. It is because it is perfect. Not almost perfect. Not good for what it is. Perfect. A complete meal in one pot that is simultaneously simple and deeply satisfying, that costs almost nothing to make, that fills the kitchen with a smell that makes every problem in the world feel slightly more manageable, and that is genuinely better the second day than it is the first. You start with a whole chicken, not pieces, because a whole chicken costs less per pound than any cut, and the carcass and skin and bones give the broth a richness and depth that boneless chicken breast could never come close to producing. You put that whole chicken in your biggest pot, cover it with cold water, add a rough chopped onion and a few stalks of celery and a carrot if you have one, and a generous amount of salt and black pepper, and bring it all to a boil. Then you reduce the heat and let it simmer low and patient for an hour and a half to 2 hours until the chicken is completely cooked through and beginning to fall apart and the broth has turned golden and fragrant and deeply flavored from hours of contact with the bones and skin. You pull the chicken out of the pot and let it cool enough to handle, then pick every bit of meat from the bones and shred it into generous pieces and return the meat to the pot and discard the bones and skin and vegetables that have given everything they had to the broth. Now you make your dumplings. Plain flour, baking powder, salt, and enough whole milk to bring it together into a soft sticky dough. Don't overwork it, don't overthink it, just mix it until it comes together and stop. Bring your broth back to a gentle simmer and drop the dumpling dough in by spoonfuls, leaving space between each one because they're going to puff and expand as they cook. Put the lid on and do not lift it for 15 minutes. The steam is what cooks the tops of the dumplings, and lifting the lid lets the steam escape and gives you flat, sad dumplings instead of the tall, pillowy ones your grandmother made. After 15 minutes, lift the lid and there they are. Fat and soft and slightly glossy on top, cooked through and tender, floating in rich golden broth with shreds of chicken visible between them. Ladle it into a deep bowl and eat it while it's hot. This is the meal that people ask for when they're sick, when they're sad, when they're cold, when they need something that feels like being taken care of. It costs about $4 for the whole pot and it makes enough for 3 or 4 meals for one person. There is nothing in any restaurant at any price that is better than a bowl of properly made chicken and dumplings eaten hot from a pot you made yourself. Number 3. Vegetable beef soup. The key to vegetable beef soup that actually tastes like something that has the deep, dark, rich, almost smoky flavor that your grandmothers had and that restaurant versions and canned versions never come close to achieving is browning the meat properly before anything else goes in the pot. You take your beef, whatever cheap cut you can find, chuck, stew meat, short ribs if they're on sale, and you cut it into pieces if it isn't already, pat it completely dry with a paper towel, season it generously with salt and pepper, and sear it in batches in a hot pot with a little lard or oil until every surface is deeply browned and almost crusted. Do not crowd the pan. Do not rush the step. The browning is where the flavor comes from. The Maillard reaction, though your grandmother didn't call it that, between the proteins and sugars in the meat creates hundreds of new flavor compounds that cannot be achieved any other way and that are the entire foundation of what makes this soup taste like it does. When all the meat is browned, you add your onion to the same pot in the same fat and cook it until it's soft and beginning to color at the edges, then add garlic if you use it, then your tomatoes. Canned or fine, a whole can crushed by hand, and stir everything around, scraping up all the brown bits stuck to the bottom of the pot because those bits are pure concentrated flavor and they dissolve into the liquid and distribute through the entire soup. Add your beef broth or water, nestle the meat back in, bring it to a boil, then reduce to a low simmer and let it go for an hour before you add any of the vegetables because the vegetables cook faster than the meat and you don't want them to turn to mush while the meat is still tough. After an hour, the meat should be getting tender and the broth should be dark and fragrant, and you add your potatoes and carrots and celery and whatever else you have. Green beans, corn cut from the cob, turnips, parsnips, whatever is in season and cheap, and continue simmering until everything is fully cooked through and tender and the broth has reduced slightly and concentrated. Season carefully at the end. A pot of this costs about $5 and makes enough soup to last a person 4 or 5 days, with every bowl tasting better than the one before as the flavors meld and deepen overnight in the refrigerator. Number 4. Salmon patty stew. Most people know salmon patties as something fried in a skillet, a pan-fried cake of canned salmon mixed with egg and cornmeal or cracker crumbs, golden and crispy on the outside. And that version is excellent. But the version that poor rural families often made when they wanted the salmon to stretch further and feed more people was a stew. The same basic salmon patty mixture formed into loose balls or patties and simmered directly in a pot of seasoned broth and vegetables until everything cooked together and the salmon flavor distributed through the entire pot. You make a simple broth from water and onion and celery and potato, bring it to a simmer, season it well with salt and black pepper, then drop in your salmon patties formed loosely so they hold together but aren't too compact, and let everything simmer together for 20 minutes until the potatoes are tender and the salmon has flavored the broth and the broth has flavored the salmon and the whole pot smells like something your grandmother would recognize immediately. The salmon breaks apart slightly at the edges as it cooks and thickens the broth naturally, and by the time it's done you have something that is part soup, part stew, completely filling, and deeply satisfying in a way that is difficult to describe to someone who has never tasted it. A can of pink salmon costs about $1.50. The vegetables cost another $1. The whole pot feeds one person for 2 or 3 days at a total cost of under $3. It is one of the most economical and nutritious one-pot meals in the entire canon of American poor man cooking, and almost nobody makes it anymore. Number 5. Smothered pork chops and rice. Smothered anything is one of the great techniques of Southern cooking. Browning meat in a heavy pot, then cooking it low and slow in its own juices with onions and liquid until it is completely tender and the cooking liquid has reduced into a thick, silky, deeply flavored gravy that coats everything in the pot. Smothered pork chops over rice takes this technique and produces one of the most satisfying one-pot meals in existence at a cost that would have been comfortable for the poorest family in the rural South in 1955 and is still comfortable for anyone eating alone on a budget today. You start with bone-in pork chops, always bone-in because the bone contributes flavor to the gravy in the same way a ham hock contributes flavor to beans. Season them generously with salt and pepper and whatever spices you keep, and brown them in a heavy pot in a little lard or oil until they're deeply golden on both sides. Remove them and in the same fat cook sliced onions low and slow until they're completely soft and beginning to caramelize and turn sweet. Sprinkle in flour, stir it into the fat and onions, cook it for a minute until it smells slightly nutty, then pour in broth or water slowly while stirring so the flour dissolves into the liquid without lumping and the whole thing begins to thicken into a gravy. Nestle the pork chops back in, making sure they're mostly submerged, put the lid on, and cook everything over the lowest heat your stove will manage for an hour and a half to 2 hours. The pork chops will become so tender they threaten to fall off the bone, and the gravy will have absorbed every bit of flavor from the meat and the bones and the caramelized onions and turned into something thick and dark and extraordinary. You cook your rice separately, plain white rice, cooked in water with salt, and serve the pork chops and all that gravy ladled generously over the top. 1 pot. 1 pan of rice. The whole meal costs about $4 and is one of the most comforting things you will ever eat alone at your kitchen table on a cold evening.